It was one of those evenings when the airport felt more like a crowded marketplace than a place of travel. The departure hall was alive with the sound of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements echoing from the speakers, and the hurried footsteps of travelers who seemed half exhausted before their journey had even begun. Families clutched their children's hands tightly. Business travelers tapped away on their phones, and groups of tourists carried shopping bags filled with last-minute souvenirs. Amid this everyday chaos, the crew of a flight bound for Los Angeles gathered near their boarding gate. Among them was a flight attendant who had been working for years, someone known by her colleagues for her calm smile and steady patience. No matter how difficult the flight, she always found a way to keep her tone gentle, her face welcoming, and her service professional. On the surface, she looked calm that evening too, but inside, she was tired. She had been working back-to-back flights all week, surviving on little sleep, but she reminded herself, just one more trip, then a rest day. As the boarding call began, passengers lined up. Some were cheerful, some grumpy, and some simply eager to sink into their seats. The flight attendant greeted each one with her practiced warmth. "Good evening, welcome aboard," she repeated, her smile never faltering. Then came a man who immediately stood out, not for his appearance, but for the way he carried himself. He wore an expensive suit and had the kind of expression that suggested the world owed him something. While most passengers responded to the greeting with at least a nod or a smile, he walked past without so much as eye contact. He placed his bag in the overhead compartment with a loud sigh, already radiating impatience. The attendant noticed but brushed it off. She had seen passengers like this before. Sometimes they were just stressed, sometimes they were truly difficult. Either way, it was her job to stay professional. As boarding continued, families settled in. Children climbed into seats with their toys, and couples exchanged tired smiles. But the man in the suit fidgeted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the armrest as though every second of waiting was an insult. Before the plane even pushed back from the gate, he pressed the call button. The light above his head blinked, and the attendant walked over with her usual politeness. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" she asked. Without looking at her, he said, "I need a drink. Something strong. And make it fast." She kept her tone even. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't serve drinks until after takeoff. As soon as we're in the air, I'll be happy to bring you one." The man scoffed loudly. "So I'm supposed to just sit here thirsty? What kind of service is this?" His voice carried far enough that nearby passengers turned to glance at him. The attendant felt the eyes on her, but she nodded calmly and said, "I appreciate your patience. It won't be long." Then she walked back toward the galley, silently taking a deep breath. She told herself, "Don't take it personally. Just another passenger having a bad day." The plane taxied and lifted into the air, the city lights shrinking below. As soon as the seatbelt sign switched off, the man pressed the call button again. This time he didn't just want a drink, he demanded snacks, extra pillows, and complained that his seat was too small for someone of his status. Other passengers exchanged looks. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others chuckled quietly, but most tried to ignore the disruption. The attendant, however, had no choice but to keep returning to his row, balancing trays and responding with polite apologies. Hours passed, and the requests didn't stop. He snapped his fingers when he wanted something, rolled his eyes when it wasn't immediate, and sighed loudly as though every delay was a personal insult. His words grew sharper, cutting deeper each time. At one point, when she delivered his drink, he leaned back and said, "Is this really all you do? Walk up and down the aisle like some kind of waitress in the sky?" The words stung. They were dismissive, degrading. She had heard similar comments before, but after a week of long flights and endless demands, this one felt heavier than usual. For a moment, her professional mask nearly cracked, but she forced herself to keep moving. The passengers around him grew uncomfortable too. Some muttered under their breath, "Poor woman, she doesn't deserve that," while others simply sat in silence, unwilling to get involved. As the hours dragged on, the tension grew thicker. The man wasn't just being difficult, he was becoming cruel. His voice rose again, unbelievable. "I paid good money for this, and this is the treatment I get. This airline is a joke." The attendant approached again, this time determined to calm the situation before it got worse. She bent slightly and said, "Sir, please lower your voice. You're disturbing the other passengers." But he cut her off with a mocking laugh. "You should be grateful people like me even fly with this airline. Without us, you'd be nothing." Something inside her broke. Her hand moved before her mind caught up. A sharp sound cracked through the cabin as she slapped him across the face. Gasps erupted. Heads turned. The passengers froze in shock. The man's eyes widened, his hand slowly touching his cheek where the sting lingered. The entire cabin went silent. Some passengers looked horrified, others almost relieved, and a few even whispered things like, "Well, he deserved it." The attendant's heart pounded. She instantly realized what she had done. This wasn't just a lapse of patience, it was a violation of everything she had been trained for. She stepped back, her breath quick, her mind racing. "My career is over. I've ruined everything." She braced herself for the shouting, the demands, the punishment that surely would follow. But instead, the man stood slowly, straightened his suit, and looked at her with an expression no one expected. He didn't yell. He didn't call for the captain. Instead, he said in a calm voice that carried through the stunned silence, "Now I see what my employees go through." The words left everyone speechless. Passengers exchanged confused glances, trying to understand what he meant, and the attendant, still trembling, felt her world tilt into something she couldn't yet comprehend. Because in that single sentence, the story was about to take a turn no one on that plane had imagined. The cabin was frozen in silence. For a moment, no one seemed to breathe. The slap still echoed in the minds of every passenger. The flight attendant stood there, her hand trembling, her chest tight as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. She had crossed the line, and she knew it. Years of discipline, training, and patience had all crumbled in 1 second. The man she struck didn't explode with rage. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't summon the captain like she expected. Instead, he simply straightened his suit jacket, touched his cheek briefly, and looked at her with eyes that seemed strangely calm. Then, to the shock of everyone around, he spoke words no one could make sense of. "Now I see what my employees go through." The passengers blinked. Did they hear that right? Employees. What did he mean? The attendant's mind spun in confusion. Her throat felt dry as she tried to form words but couldn't. She thought he must be mocking her again, humiliating her in front of the whole cabin. But then he did something even more surprising. He slowly stood, adjusted his tie, and turned so his voice carried through the stunned rows of passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "allow me to introduce myself properly. I am not just your fellow passenger tonight. I am the CEO of this airline." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A mother holding her child pressed her hand to her mouth. A businessman in row 5 whispered, "No way," while a young student shook his head in disbelief. The atmosphere shifted instantly, from shock at the slap to shock at the revelation. The attendant's knees felt weak. She clutched the back of a seat, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the murmurs around her. The man she had just slapped was not just a difficult customer, he was her ultimate boss. The most powerful figure in her company. Her mind screamed with panic. "This is it. Not just the end of my job. The end of everything. I'll be fired, disgraced. I'll never work again." But the CEO's face didn't carry anger. Instead, it held a strange mixture of seriousness and reflection. He looked at her, not as though she had humiliated him, but as though she had proven something. He raised a hand gently, and the murmurs died down. His tone was steady, commanding attention, but not aggression. "Some of you may be confused by my behavior tonight," he began, "and I understand. It seemed rude. It seemed unnecessary. But let me explain. I boarded this flight incognito. I wanted to see what my crew, my employees, truly go through when dealing with passengers. Reports and numbers can never tell the real story. I wanted to feel it, to see it." The cabin was quiet again, everyone hanging on to his words. "And so," he continued, "I became the very thing I've been told exists on nearly every flight, a difficult passenger. I demanded, I insulted, I pushed. I wanted to test the limits of patience, to see how far our staff could be stretched before something snapped." All eyes shifted to the attendant. She stood frozen, tears beginning to sting her eyes, unable to speak. The CEO looked back at her, his expression softening. "Last night, I discovered something important. Even the strongest patience has limits. Even the most professional staff can break when faced with cruelty. And if someone as skilled and composed as this woman could be pushed to that point, then what does that say about the weight we've been forcing on all our crews for years?" The words hit like thunder. Passengers sat back in their seats, some nodding slowly, others glancing at the attendant with new respect. A few even clapped softly, though most stayed quiet, still processing the shock. The attendant's tears finally spilled. She covered her mouth with one hand, shaking her head as though to say, "Please stop. I can't bear this." But the CEO wasn't condemning her. He was lifting her up in front of everyone. He turned back to the cabin. What happened here was not a failure. It was proof. Proof that we as a company have been blind to the real struggles of our people. Proof that change is not optional, it is necessary. For the rest of the flight, the cabin felt different. The tension dissolved, replaced with a quiet awe. The man who had been the villain of the night was now seen in a completely different light. And the flight attendant, who had feared she had destroyed her career, was suddenly seen as the person who revealed the truth in the most unexpected way. Some passengers even offered her small smiles of encouragement when she walked by. Silent gestures that said, "You're not alone." A woman whispered as she passed, "You're brave." But inside, the attendant was still trembling. She couldn't reconcile what had happened. How could something so disastrous feel like it was turning into something else? She kept expecting him to change his mind, to suddenly switch back into anger. But he didn't. When the plane landed hours later, the usual rush to exit felt slower. People moved with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Some passengers whispered about how they would never forget this flight. Others simply shook their heads. Still stunned, the attendant stayed near the door, thanking passengers as they left, though her voice wavered. When the CEO approached, she braced herself for a private scolding. But instead, he leaned slightly closer and spoke softly, just for her. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said. "We have work to do, not against you, but because of you." She stared at him, speechless, as he walked calmly down the jet bridge. By the time she stepped off the plane herself, her legs felt like jelly. She still didn't know if she was safe, if she was forgiven, or if this was some strange dream. All she knew was that her life had just changed forever. What she thought would be the end of her career had just opened the door to something she couldn't yet imagine. The morning after the flight felt heavy, as though the weight of the entire night was pressing down on the flight attendant's shoulders. She had hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the slap, the stunned silence, and then the shocking reveal. She remembered gripping the seat to steady herself when the suited man calmly declared he was the CEO of the airline. She rose from her bed with the dull ache of exhaustion in her bones. Her reflection in the mirror looked like someone who had aged overnight. Dark circles under her eyes, lips pressed in worry, and that constant question circling her mind. What now? She imagined the worst: suspension, termination, perhaps even a lawsuit. How could she ever explain slapping her own CEO? Even if he had provoked her, even if he admitted pushing her, rules were rules. Airlines did not tolerate crew crossing that line. Still, there was no escape. She had been summoned. When she arrived at the airline's headquarters, she felt like she was walking into a trial. The glass doors opened, reflecting the morning sun, and the lobby was buzzing with employees in suits carrying files and coffee cups. She had been here before, but only for yearly training sessions, never for something as personal as this. At the reception desk, her name was already on the list. The receptionist smiled warmly, which surprised her. "He's expecting you," the woman said kindly. As if she knew how nervous the flight attendant must be, she walked down the long corridor, her heart pounding louder with each step. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee, but all she could focus on was the looming door at the end. The CEO's office. When she stepped inside, she froze. He was standing by the wide glass windows, hands behind his back, looking out at the runways where planes took off and landed. His posture was calm, almost contemplative. For a brief second, he didn't look like a man who had been slapped in front of dozens of passengers. He looked like someone carrying a burden much heavier than hers. "Please, sit," he said, turning toward her with a steady gaze. His voice wasn't cold, wasn't angry, just measured. She sat carefully on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She forced herself to speak before fear consumed her. "Sir, I want to apologize. I lost control. It was unprofessional. I accept whatever decision you make." Her throat tightened around the words, but she pushed them out anyway. The CEO studied her quietly, then leaned forward slightly on his desk. "I don't want your apology," he said. Her breath caught. She blinked, confused. "Sir, I didn't call you here to scold you or to end your career," he continued, his tone steady. "I called you here because last night was the first time I saw the truth with my own eyes." She frowned slightly, still trying to process. "The truth," he nodded. "Reports don't capture it. Numbers on a spreadsheet, customer surveys, profit margins. None of it shows what you go through up there. The patience it takes, the way you absorb every insult, every unreasonable demand. Last night, I became the very problem our crews have been warning me about. And when I pushed too far, I saw the breaking point." Her lips parted, but no words came. She expected him to speak of discipline, of rules she broke. But instead he spoke as if she had revealed something valuable. He stood and walked slowly across the room, his hands now resting at his sides. "Do you know why I boarded without announcing myself? Why I acted the way I did?" She shook her head. "Because I wanted to understand. I wanted to feel what my staff feel, to experience the pressure from the other side. I could have read reports all day, but that would never show me the human cost. So I tested it. And you, without knowing it, gave me the answer I needed." Tears welled in her eyes. She tried to hold them back, embarrassed, but a few slipped down her cheeks. I thought I had ruined everything." His expression softened. "On the contrary, you've started something." She stared at him in disbelief. "I am not here to fire you," he said firmly. "I am here to thank you. Because your reaction, though unpolished, was human. And sometimes humanity reveals more truth than professionalism ever could." She covered her mouth with one hand, a sob escaping quietly. The tension that had gripped her chest for hours began to ease, just slightly. The CEO returned to his chair, but his tone remained serious. "This isn't just about you, though. What happened on that flight is about every crew member. You weren't alone in that slap. You were carrying all of them with you. And if one breaking point can reveal so much, imagine what thousands of unspoken breaking points are saying silently every day." The weight of his words sank deep. She felt small in that moment, yet strangely powerful, too. "So here's what will happen," he continued. "You will not be punished. Instead, I want you to sit with us as we begin something new. I need your voice in the room, not a polished report, not a manager who hasn't served a flight in years. I need someone who knows the cabin, who knows what it feels like to stand in that aisle, smiling while their patience is chipped away piece by piece." She shook her head slightly. "Overwhelmed. Me, you are not just anything," he interrupted gently. "You are the reason I now see what I couldn't see before." Her tears flowed freely now, but she didn't wipe them. For the first time since last night, she felt something she hadn't expected at all: relief. Maybe even hope. The meeting ended not with punishment, not with dismissal, but with a sense of beginning. As she left his office, the polished floors and glass walls no longer felt intimidating. They felt like the starting line of a journey she never planned for. And as she stepped outside into the daylight, her chest rose with a deeper breath than she had taken in days. For the first time, she wasn't walking as someone fearing the end. She was walking as someone who, through one imperfect moment, had become the spark of change. The days following that meeting were unlike anything the flight attendant had experienced in her career. Normally, after a dramatic incident, gossip would fade and life would return to the routine rhythm of flights, boarding calls, and layovers. But this time, things didn't fade. Something had shifted, and she could feel it in the air every time she put on her uniform. At first, it was whispers. Colleagues in the crew lounge lowered their voices when she walked in. Some gave her supportive nods, others looked at her with curiosity, and a few even seemed intimidated. She wasn't sure if people saw her as a hero, a troublemaker, or something in between. She didn't feel like either. She still woke up tired, still tied her hair back the same way, still went through the safety checks like everyone else. Yet she knew she carried something none of them did, the memory of that moment, the slap heard across a cabin, and the meeting that followed. Meanwhile, at headquarters, the CEO wasted no time. Within days, emails were sent to crew members across the company. Not the usual corporate updates filled with numbers and slogans, but invitations, real invitations to speak. The message was clear: your voices matter. We want to hear what you face every day. At first, there was skepticism. Many attendants had been with the airline long enough to know that listening sessions often led nowhere. They remembered promises made in the past that were quietly shelved later, but curiosity pulled them in. Soon, conference rooms that were once filled with managers and executives were now filled with flight attendants, mechanics, and ground staff sitting across from people in suits. The CEO was present at many of these sessions, not sitting at the head of the table, but often in the middle, notebook open, pen in hand. He didn't lecture. He didn't dismiss. He asked, "What is the hardest part of your job? What makes you dread coming to work? What would make you feel respected?" At first, the answers were cautious. A flight attendant spoke about constant fatigue, missing birthdays and anniversaries because of back-to-back schedules. A ground handler shared how his team often felt invisible, working long hours in harsh weather for little recognition. A mechanic admitted he sometimes felt pressured to rush through checks to avoid delays. As the days went on, the caution melted. Voices grew stronger, more honest. People who had once believed speaking up was pointless now found themselves talking for an hour straight, sharing frustrations they had buried for years. And through it all, the woman who had thought her career was over sat quietly in many of those rooms, watching it unfold. She wasn't there to dominate the conversation. She was there as a reminder that change had started because someone finally broke under the weight of silence. One day, during a particularly tense session, a senior executive muttered under his breath, "We can't just bend to every complaint." The room went quiet. The CEO turned to him sharply and said, "We're not bending. We're finally listening. There's a difference." It was clear that resistance still existed. Some leaders worried that empowering staff would weaken authority. Some feared passengers would rebel against stricter rules about respect. But the CEO didn't back down. "If we want to be a world-class airline," he said, "we can't just polish the planes. We must honor the people who run them." Soon, reforms began rolling out. They weren't vague promises or empty slogans. They were practical steps. Crew schedules were adjusted, giving attendants longer rest periods between long-haul flights. Training programs were updated to include not just service protocols, but mental health support and conflict resolution tools. One of the boldest reforms came when the airline introduced a clear policy. Verbal abuse of staff would no longer be tolerated. Passengers who crossed the line would be issued warnings and, in severe cases, placed on a no-fly list. When the announcement was made, some crew members cried quietly in relief. For years, they had been told the customer was always right. Now, for the first time, someone was saying, "Our staff are right too." The cultural shift wasn't instant, but it was undeniable. Word spread quickly among crews. Stories surfaced of attendants being backed up by captains, of managers stepping in to protect their teams, of unruly passengers being firmly dealt with instead of excused. The woman at the center of it all kept a low profile. She still flew routes, still poured coffee, still smiled at boarding passengers, but her colleagues now treated her differently. In the galley on one flight, a younger attendant whispered, "Because of you, we're not afraid anymore." The words stunned her. She had never thought of herself as brave, only human. One evening, after a regional flight, she sat with a fellow crew member in the lounge. He leaned closer and said, "Funny how it works. You thought your mistake would end you, but it started all of this." She shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't start anything. I just broke." He smiled knowingly. Sometimes breaking is the only way the truth gets through. That night, as she walked back to her apartment, the city lights glowing around her, she let the words sink in. Maybe he was right. Maybe the slap wasn't just a mistake. Maybe it was a crack in the wall that had hidden the struggles of thousands of employees. For too long. And now, that wall was crumbling. The CEO, too, changed. He was no longer just a figurehead behind closed doors. He walked the terminals, rode on flights quietly, spoke with staff without cameras or press. When asked why he was doing it, he simply replied, "Because leadership without listening is just a title." For the woman who had once dreaded stepping into his office, it was surreal. She hadn't wanted to be part of corporate meetings, yet she now found herself regularly invited to share insights. She didn't see herself as a leader, but others began to. Her life hadn't returned to normal, because normal no longer existed. The airline was changing, and so was she. What she once thought would destroy her career had instead reshaped it entirely. And though she didn't fully understand it yet, she was no longer just a flight attendant. She had become the face of something much larger, a reminder that sometimes the smallest human moments can spark the biggest transformations. At first, the reforms felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Flight attendants whispered about longer rest periods with a kind of disbelief, as if it were too good to be true. Mechanics spoke about finally having the time to do their checks without feeling rushed. Even ground staff, usually invisible in company discussions, felt recognized. But just as quickly as the excitement spread, resistance began to creep in, inside headquarters, behind the polished glass walls. Not everyone was pleased with the CEO's new direction. Some executives whispered in hallways, their voices sharp with disapproval. "If we start banning passengers for being rude, we'll lose customers," one complained. Another argued, "More rest time for crew means fewer flights in the schedule. That means fewer profits." Numbers, charts, and margins became their weapons. They weren't blind to the humanity of the staff, they simply valued the balance sheet more. And in their minds, kindness looked like weakness. Passengers, too, had mixed reactions. Many appreciated the changes, noticing the calmer, happier faces of crew members who were no longer stretched to the limit. But there were others who bristled at the new firmness. One man who had been denied alcohol after verbally abusing a crew member wrote a furious online post, calling the airline too soft. Another woman complained to customer service, insisting she had the right to speak however she wanted because she had paid for a premium ticket. The backlash began to grow louder. News outlets picked up stories, some praising the airline's new stance, others questioning whether protecting staff might hurt customer satisfaction. Social media split into two camps, one applauding the reforms, the other mocking the airline for coddling employees. For the flight attendant at the heart of it all, life became complicated. Colleagues treated her with quiet admiration, but she felt the invisible weight of expectation pressing down harder than ever. Every time she walked into a meeting with executives, she knew she was representing not just herself, but thousands of employees whose voices had been ignored for years. One night, after a long-haul flight, she sat in her small apartment with the city lights flickering outside. The silence felt louder than usual. She curled her hands around a mug of tea and asked herself, "Am I strong enough for this?" She hadn't chosen to be the center of this storm. She hadn't asked to be the symbol of change. All she had wanted was to do her job with dignity. Now, the entire company seemed to look to her as if she were the anchor holding the reforms together. The doubts deepened during a heated meeting weeks later. She sat quietly at the table, listening as executives debated. One of them, a senior manager with decades in the industry, leaned forward and said bluntly, "With all due respect, one outburst doesn't qualify someone to redefine our company culture." His words were sharp, almost dismissive. The room tensed. All eyes shifted toward her. She felt her stomach twist, her throat dry, but she didn't let the silence choke her. She spoke softly, not with anger, but with raw honesty. "I didn't ask to be here," she began, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I didn't plan to be the one sitting in this chair. But what happened that night wasn't just about me. It was about every single one of us who's ever been pushed past our limit. You can say it was just an outburst, but if you think that's all it was, then you're missing the truth. That slap wasn't only mine, it belonged to thousands of staff who have been carrying burdens in silence." The room went still. The executive who had challenged her looked down at his notes, unable to meet her eyes. Around the table, some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded slowly. Her words weren't polished, but they were undeniable. Yet even as her voice carried, she knew the resistance wasn't going away. Change never came smoothly. Some managers quietly stalled the reforms, dragging their feet on implementation. Some staff themselves doubted whether the promises would last, their hope fragile after years of disappointment. Even the CEO felt the weight. One evening, he called her into his office, his tie loosened, his face drawn with fatigue. "This is harder than I thought," he admitted. "They're pushing back at every turn. Some want to go back to the old ways. They think this is just a phase." She studied him carefully. He didn't look like the untouchable figure she once feared. He looked human, tired, maybe even a little afraid of losing the battle he had started. "Then maybe," she said gently, "we remind them why we started in the first place." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if her words had reignited something inside him. Outside the office, however, the tension continued. Rumors spread of shareholders questioning the reforms, worried about financial losses. A few union representatives argued that promises weren't enough. They wanted contracts in writing. Even some passengers began testing the system deliberately, seeing how far they could push before being warned. It was messy. It was exhausting. At times, the flight attendant wondered if the whole thing would collapse under the pressure. Would the reforms survive, or would the old habits swallow them whole? But amid the chaos, there were small victories that reminded her why it mattered. A young attendant told her quietly, "I used to cry after flights because of the way some passengers treated me. But last week, when one man shouted at me, my captain stood by my side. For the first time, I didn't feel alone." Those words carried her through the storm, because maybe this wasn't about winning every battle at once. Maybe it was about moments like that moment where someone finally felt seen, heard, and supported. And while the backlash grew louder, so did the quiet strength of those who believed. The slap had started it, but what came after would decide whether it was just a moment in time or the beginning of a permanent change. Several months had passed since the reforms began. The airline looked the same from the outside, same planes, same uniforms, same boarding calls echoing through the terminals. But inside, things were different. Crew members spoke with a little more ease, their steps felt a little lighter, and their eyes carried a quiet confidence they hadn't known before. Yet there was still a question hanging in the air. Would these changes hold when tested? That test came one evening on a long-haul flight bound for Europe. The cabin was full, passengers squeezed into every seat, overhead bins crammed with luggage. The crew had already been warned about a particular passenger during boarding, a man who had caused a scene at the gate over a seating issue. By the time the plane leveled out above the clouds, it became clear he wasn't going to let the issue go. He started with loud complaints. "This seat is unacceptable," he barked, even though he was sitting exactly where he had booked. His words carried through the cabin, pulling glances from nearby passengers. The attendants did what they always did. They approached with calm voices, offered pillows, drinks, whatever small comfort they could provide. But he wasn't interested in solutions. He wanted control. He snapped his fingers to call attendants over, demanded immediate service, and raised his voice each time he felt he wasn't being catered to quickly enough. In the old days, the crew might have bent further, apologizing endlessly, absorbing his anger just to keep the peace. But this wasn't the old days anymore. The lead attendant, a calm but firm woman who had been flying for more than a decade, approached him and knelt slightly by his seat so her voice wouldn't disturb the entire cabin. "Sir," she said evenly, "I want to make sure you're comfortable, but please remember to keep your tone respectful." He blinked at her in disbelief, unused to hearing such firmness. He scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively. "Respect? I'm the customer here. You should be respecting me." The attendant straightened, her expression professional but unwavering. "And we do respect you. But our staff also deserve respect. If this behavior continues, we will have to take further action." Passengers nearby perked up. They had never heard an attendant speak like that before. Some smiled quietly, others whispered to each other, impressed by the courage. The man, however, only grew louder. "This is ridiculous. I paid for this ticket, and you people treat me like a criminal." At that moment, another attendant joined in, not as backup in panic, but as reinforcement in solidarity. "Sir," he said firmly, "you've been warned. If the disrespect continues, we will report this to the captain." The man laughed bitterly. "The captain? What's he going to do? Throw me out midair?" The crew exchanged glances. It was time. The lead attendant walked to the cockpit, spoke quietly with the captain, and within minutes, the captain himself stepped into the cabin. His presence was commanding, not aggressive, just solid. He looked directly at the disruptive passenger and said in a voice that carried through the aisle, "Sir, this airline does not tolerate abuse toward its staff. You've been warned. If this behavior continues, we will divert this flight, and you will not be allowed to continue your journey with us." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers stared wide-eyed. The man's smirk faltered. For the first time, he realized the crew wasn't bluffing. He grumbled under his breath, muttered something about terrible service, and slumped into his seat. But the shouting stopped. The demands ended. The rest of the flight went on smoothly, the tension slowly melting into relief. In the galley, the attendants gathered quietly, their hands still shaking from the adrenaline. But instead of fear, they felt something else, something new. "We actually did it," one whispered. "We stood our ground," another said, her voice trembling with both nerves and pride. "And the captain backed us," the lead attendant added softly. For once, we weren't alone. The moment spread quickly after landing. Word reached crews across different bases, whispered in lounges and mess halls. It wasn't just another flight story, it was proof. Proof that the reforms weren't just pretty words in an email, but real, alive, working in practice. When the flight attendant, who had unknowingly started it all, heard the story, she was sitting in a hotel room after a short domestic run. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. "It happened. They stood by us. For once, we didn't feel powerless." She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen. A lump rose in her throat, her chest tight with emotion. She hadn't been on that flight, but somehow she was part of it. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered to herself, "It worked." Meanwhile, at headquarters, the CEO shared the incident during a board meeting. His voice was calm but resolute. "This," he said, "is the reason we made these changes. Not for headlines, not for image, but for moments like this when our people know they are valued, protected, and respected." For once, even the most resistant executives had no argument. The success spoke for itself. The crew had faced the test, and the system had held. From that day forward, a quiet but unshakable shift took root in the airline's culture. Staff no longer whispered their frustrations into the void. They spoke openly, knowing someone was listening. Passengers, too, began to notice. Many applauded the firmer stance, relieved to see staff treated as humans rather than servants. And those who didn't like it, they had a choice: either adapt or fly elsewhere. For the woman whose single breaking point had sparked it all, the story was deeply personal. She remembered the sting of fear, the weight of thinking her career was over. She remembered standing in front of the CEO, bracing for the end, only to hear the words, "We have work to do." Now, hearing how crews stood together, how captains stepped out of cockpits to defend their teams, she realized something profound. Her mistake had become her legacy. The slap had been a crack in the surface, a moment of imperfection. But through that crack, the light had entered. And now, that light was spreading, one flight at a time. A year later, the airline didn't just look different on paper, it felt different in the air. The uniforms were the same, the announcements sounded familiar, the aircraft engines still roared as always. But behind the service smiles and safety demonstrations, there was something new: dignity. Crew members carried themselves with a kind of quiet pride that hadn't been there before. Passengers noticed it too. Some even commented, "The staff seem happier these days," without realizing the battles that had been fought to make that happiness possible. For the flight attendant, at the center of it all, life had taken a path she never expected. She was still working flights, walking up and down aisles, serving meals, calming children, smiling at strangers. But something had shifted deep inside her. She no longer felt like she was just surviving shifts. She felt like she belonged to something that mattered. Colleagues treated her differently too. In the galley, someone would lean in and whisper, "Because of you, I finally feel seen." In crew lounges, newer attendants sometimes approached shyly, saying they had joined the airline after hearing about the reforms. To them, she wasn't just another flight attendant. She was proof that one person's breaking point could open the door for thousands of others to breathe easier. Yet she didn't wear the title of hero comfortably. She often said to colleagues, "I'm not special. I just lost control." But they always shook their heads. One young attendant once told her, "Yes, you lost control. But sometimes that's exactly what it takes to change what's out of control." Those words stayed with her. The CEO's leadership had also evolved. He was no longer seen as a distant figure in a corner office. He made regular appearances at airports, walking among the staff with a notebook in his hand. He sat in break rooms, listening more than speaking. He joined flights, not as an observer but as a silent learner, watching the rhythm of the cabin. When crew members thanked him for the reforms, he would always reply, "Don't thank me. Thank the one who showed me the truth." Their partnership was unlikely. A flight attendant who had thought her career was over, and a CEO who had once pretended to be the very passenger crews dreaded most. Yet together, they had sparked something that was no longer just about one airline. Other companies began to notice. At conferences, journalists asked the CEO about the reforms, and he never hesitated to tell the story of the night everything changed. Of course, not everything was perfect. No industry transforms overnight. There were still passengers who tested limits, still managers who resisted progress, still long hours that wore people down. But the difference was in how those struggles were faced. Staff no longer felt powerless. They knew they had policies, leadership, and most importantly, solidarity on their side. For the flight attendant, the biggest change wasn't in the rules or the policies. It was in the way she carried herself. She no longer second-guessed her worth. She no longer swallowed every insult silently, thinking it was part of the job. She had found her voice, and with it, she had helped others find theirs too. One evening, on a late flight with most of the cabin asleep, she stood near the galley with a colleague. The hum of the engines filled the quiet air. Her colleague looked at her thoughtfully and said, "It's strange, isn't it? One moment, one mistake, and suddenly everything shifts." She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the stars outside the window. "Not everything," she said softly, "but just enough." Later, when the plane landed and she walked through the terminal, she noticed something she never used to see: passengers thanking crew sincerely, not out of habit, but with genuine warmth. A father carrying a toddler stopped and said, "Thank you for looking after us tonight." A woman with tired eyes whispered, "I know your job isn't easy. I appreciate you." Small gestures, but powerful ones. Moments like that reminded her why she still loved the skies. Even after everything, looking back on the night of the slap, she no longer saw it only as a failure. Yes, it had been unprofessional. Yes, it had been risky, but it had also been real. And sometimes reality, raw, imperfect, human, was what forced the world to pay attention. She often told herself, if that night hadn't happened, maybe we'd still be silent. Maybe nothing would have changed. The CEO, too, reflected often. In a speech to staff months later, he admitted, leadership doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it comes from the aisle of an airplane, in the middle of a storm we didn't expect. One learned more in one flight than I did in years of boardroom meetings, and for that, I am grateful. As the applause filled the room, the flight attendant sat quietly among her peers, her heart swelling, but her head bowed. She didn't crave the spotlight. All she wanted was for people like her, the ones who worked long hours with steady smiles, to be treated as more than just uniforms. And now, slowly but surely, that was happening. On another quiet night, months later, she found herself standing again by the galley window on a transatlantic flight. The cabin lights were dim, passengers asleep, the stars endless beyond the glass. She pressed her hand lightly to the wall of the aircraft, feeling the vibrations of the engines carrying them forward. For the first time in years, she felt peace, not because the job had become easy, but because it had become fair. Not because problems had vanished, but because she no longer had to face them alone. Her journey hadn't ended with that slap. It had only just begun. And as the plane soared into the night sky, she smiled to herself, knowing that sometimes the smallest human stories born out of mistakes and imperfections, are the ones that ripple outward. Changing lives far beyond what we can see. Asterisk.